welcome to Mad Dogs and Englishmen Friday edition. Nothing to say about the weather today. It's just one of those days that there's really nothing to remark on. We got some politics stuff to talk about, and the first subject I wanted to bring up, though, is sort of political in a sense, but it's also very personal in a way, and I think Charlie's kind of a good person to talk to about this because of his particular background, which is growing up in the UK and spending a lot of time in Europe. You and I both get to work on trains. You take the Metro North from where you live in the suburbs, and I take the subway from downtown, and I used to have to take the same train that you did every day. And of course, Jack, our publisher, takes it from way the hell out. He's 2 hours each way every day, and it's just sort of terrible. It's a mess. It's unreliable. It's runs late. The New York City subways do the same thing. But the thing's really bothersome to me about this is that they are comparatively expensive comparatively compared to, that's a very eloquent way to put that, compared to their European counterparts, their Asian counterparts. The Hong Kong subway famously turns a small profit and doesn't require the huge subsidies that we do. And of course, neither one of us has to take the Long Island Railroad, which is the real nightmare train around here. So I'm trying to figure out, and this is sort of something that perplexes me, and I got into this a little bit a couple of weeks ago when I was writing about Monocle magazine and their various public transit obsessions, is that people on the left really like public transit, and some people on the right like it too. And I think there's a case to be made for mass transit, although I don't really want the government involved in it very much. But I think it's a really good example of the fact that people on the left and these sort of urban, crunchy, soy latte, progressive types look at these European institutions, whether it's, healthcare, whether it's not being allowed to call your employees after 6 o'clock in France. In Germany, I think, actually, as it turns out, is the same way. And they say, well, if we could only do what they do, then we had the same sorts of things here. But, when I compare these trains to what they look like in Zurich or even London, which isn't a great system, but it's not a terrible one, we aren't really good at doing European-style social welfare, mass transit, and other kinds of things here. So first of all, I'd like to hear about how nightmarish, if at all, your ride-in was today. And secondly, why is it in the American context, this stuff that we think we would like to do, at least some of us think we would like to do in the European way, just never seems to work?
Well, America, I think, with transport, does the opposite of Europe, right? Which is that Americans transport goods by train, generally, and people by airplane. I think I'm right in saying in Europe that tends to be the other way around. I think France, Germany, they move stuff by flying it, but they tend to move people on the trains. I should say that the trains run extremely well in Switzerland, but they don't run that well in England, even after privatization, and they're pretty expensive. If you drive from where my parents live in Cambridge to London, even with the very high gas prices, you'll be saving maybe £10-15. So a ticket is almost twice as much as it would cost to drive to on the train. So it's not a very cost effective. It's an extremely useful way of going out for a boozy lunch, because you can't drive, but it's not a particularly economical way unless you're over 65 or you buy a season ticket or so on and so forth. But so I'm not sure England is a particularly good example. I mean, America has a number of factors that do not lend it to mass transit. The first is that it's very big, and there are a lot of people here. Canada is a very big country, but they're all close to the American border, and there aren't that many. Was it 35 million? Is that too low? 35 million people in Canada? Is that?
I don't know, but yeah, it's not very large.
Australia is the same way, but 310 million people in a very big country like this. The second reason, I think, is that Americans are dispositionally individualistic. At least they have been historically. And I like to make the joke that I don't like any form of transport on which I can't either choose the passengers or upgrade myself to get away from them. But there is at the heart of that an individualistic sentiment that I can get in my car and drive anywhere. I can just go. And if I want to turn left, I can turn left. And if I want to turn right, and if I want to stop, and if I want to go and visit a friend who lives in the middle of nowhere, there is really no limitation whatsoever. But a train is quite annoying. You probably have to get picked up from the station. You have to get a cab. They're late. And they're terrible on Metro North on that, especially if it snows. You'd think you were living in. So people like the convenience. They like the individual nature of it. And I think that historically Americans forget that the railways that were put in were pretty much obsolete by the time they were finished.
Yeah.
And when we talk about internal improvement, there's this myth, really, that the last great, American internal project, look at the railroads, but, not really.
Yeah, a lot of cronyism there, that sort of stuff. I've written this before, that I think that the reason that trains naturally appeal to people who have a central planning mentality, because you tell your car where to go, but a train tells you where you're going. Trains only go one place, and then they lend themselves to various kinds of urban planning schemes from out there, from designing, from around train stations, from around the tracks and things like that. But I think there's something else too, that I think that it's for the same reason that government at all levels, it seems to me, in the United States is less effective than it is in lots of other comparable countries. Not that there really are comparable countries. We're a very unusual country. And I think when people compare us to, say, Canada, it's always kind of silly because, as you pointed out, we're an enormous, spread out country with a big, diverse population, and they're not.
Well, you're also, and I'm sure this is going to speak to what you're about to say, but you're also a country that was explicitly founded by a violent revolution and then justified with ideals. Yeah. And that does very much change the nature of the country, for example, compared to my own, which was a slow evolution. Yes, there was violence. Yes, there were civil wars. Yes, there was a glorious revolution, but it was a very slow, gradual process, and our constitution and our institutions reflect that. In America, it is largely the product of a British culture, but it does matter that they overthrew the government and started, and that informs the culture, I think. But
if that informs the culture, then wouldn't you think that we would keep government that we have on a tighter leash and expect more out of it? Everything, if you compare, say, Medicaid to the efficiency of, not that they're terribly efficient, but just apples and apples comparison versus European systems that do similar things, we have a lot more waste, a lot more fraud, a lot less efficiency. And you and I travel a fair amount. You notice this when you do things like when you go through customs at an airport. Spain is not a famously efficient country, but going through customs and immigration in Madrid, last time I was there, I timed it. I think it took me 4 minutes. Last time I came through JFK in New York, took me 2 hours, and that was me coming in, as a national, whereas I'm going through Spain as a foreigner. If you look at things like airport security in Amsterdam, and you wouldn't expect Amsterdam to be all that efficient. Everyone's kind of high and Dutch and that sort of thing.
No, but I think that the individualism of the country, in some regards, explains why the government is inefficient. I mean, for example, if you were to commit 1/100th of the Medicare fraud in a country like Singapore, you'd be executed.
Almost certain.
Yeah, literally. Now, they're happy with that system. Singaporeans are not, by and large, rising up. They don't talk with dewy eyes about Thomas Jefferson. They don't, put immigrants under flags and hand them cards and have people clap. It's just not that sort of country. There's no great American dream. They don't talk about the Statue of Liberty and that, the Golden Gate Bridge. They just get on with it. Now, Americans simultaneously want some form of Medicare and Medicaid, it seems, but they also want to maintain a much more classically liberal culture, and a more classically liberal culture combined with a government program like Medicare is going to lead to fraud and abuse and waste and inefficiency, and to the reluctance at its root to get on board with the sort of government control that does make these programs efficient. I mean, this is what really, I think, is at the root of the Obamacare question the left can't quite grasp or won't quite accept. Francis Fukuyama was astonished in the Wall Street Journal 6 months ago that Americans are still upset about this healthcare law and are still debating it 5 years later. And he said, well, nowhere else in the world would there be this level of individualized resistance to a government healthcare scheme. Nowhere else in the world would there be this level of resistance to tightened gun laws or personal liability insurance that you are forced to get elsewhere.
When I hear that, I think two things. I think, A, Frank Fukuyama, you're right. and B, you're welcome.
No, I agree. But what I'm saying here, I suppose my point is, when we, and this goes back to our talk about epistemological differences, but culture, and I'll talk about guns, I suppose, with Switzerland and America, but culture really, really matters, is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
So a single-payer system in Switzerland or in France, the people of those countries have different expectations of citizenship. So they will say, oh, okay, well, I will
neither one of
give
them
up.
has a single-payer system, though, do they?
No, France has a single-payer system with privatized hospitals.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Britain has a single-payer system with nationalized hospitals,
Right.
because it's basically the world's oldest healthcare system, but let's not get into that. Yeah. Anyway, the point I'm making is that we can talk about a single payer all day or Medicare all day and so on, but when you apply that to an American culture of individualism, you're just going to get a lot of pushback and a lot of frayed edges in the way that you don't in a country where people frankly fall in line.
Yeah. I don't know if you know this about me, but we travel together some. So I have this weird obsessive thing about punctuality in certain contexts. I mean, sometimes not in my National Review deadlines, but in other contexts in life I do. I'm the guy who gets to the airport 2 hours ahead of time. I'm the guy who, I obviously see a lot of plays because of my play reviewing gig, and I'm the guy who's always at the theater at least 15 minutes before, that sort of thing. And so, when I was in Switzerland last year, this is an enormously appealing place to me for a lot of ways, because it's great. You get on a Swiss train and it says it's going to leave at 4:46, and it leaves at 4:46 exactly, not 4:45, not 4:48. There's no little window in there. It moves, and so you go to you obviously understand why the sort of great capital cities are attractive when you visit them. I've never been to Paris, but I understand why Paris would be attractive. I spent a fair amount of time in London. Now, tourist London, I assume, is not very much like living in London, in the same way that tourist New York is not very much like living in New York. But you go to these, sort of second-tier European cities. Like I was in Stuttgart last year visiting the Mercedes-Benz factory there. Interesting place, by the way. And but you see the trains, you see the mass transit, the other sorts of things they have, and you get why a certain sort of American, particularly an American with a kind of progressive sensibility, looks at these cities and says, "Oh, this is what we should do back home." And then I come back and I get on the Metro North and I say, if we tried to do that stuff back here in the United States, it just wouldn't work. And the thing that's really shocking to me about it is that I spent some time a couple of months ago comparing regional rail systems, the subsidies and all that kind of stuff. And not only are ours worse, but they're a lot more expensive. They're not necessarily more expensive out of pocket, but they're more expensive once you figure in the subsidies. I think I remembered reading that the average trip on the Long Island Railroad, and the tickets there aren't that cheap. I think it's maybe $20 to get out to a place I normally go out there. But there's like a $38 subsidy on top of that. So it's basically costing $60 to go back and forth in one little suburban region, which is just absurdly inefficient. And then you start looking like, okay, these guys, them, the guys who tear your ticket and punch your little thing on the Metro North, those guys earn well into the six figures for punching pieces of paper, and it's just all kind of absurd. And so what I guess I'm wanting to draw out of that is that transit's one thing, and mass transit sort of makes sense in some urban contexts, in some places it doesn't. It kind of makes sense in a place like New York. It makes maybe a little less sense in Washington. I have some liberal friends down in Houston, and they're always, why don't we have a rail system here? Because your population density is that of Mars, basically. You've got one person for every 10 square miles. You're not really going to have much of a subway there. So, the mass transit thing is one thing, but then we start looking at these other European things that the American left wants to copy, notably healthcare. Obamacare is to some extent modeled on the Swiss system. It's supposed to replicate aspects of that with the various mandates and subsidies for the insurance markets and all that. But you get the feeling that sort of just like our trains don't work the way theirs do, our version of Swiss healthcare is probably not going to look very Swiss at the end of the day.
No, and this is a pretty brutal thing to say, I imagine, but I think it's true that when an American tourist goes through France, for example, and says, oh, well, I wish the railways were like this, inherent in the statement is, and I wish Americans were like the French. I mean, Bill Maher, for example, doesn't hide this at all. He said recently on his show that if we got rid of, I mean, I don't think he literally meant killed, but he was lamenting that there are all these people in the middle of the country who are ruining it for him. And he said we could be like Europe if it weren't for all of these Americans, which, you know, it always amused me when we talk about Obamacare, for example, that one of the left's arguments is, yeah, well, look, this would work much better if the states would only play ball.
Right.
Well, that's a bit like saying, well, I'd have sold 1 million copies of my book if only Americans had wanted to read it. It's not as if there was an instruction that came down and these governors and the citizens of the states that haven't played ball with Obamacare and refused to set up exchanges and haven't expanded Medicaid refused and revolted and picked up arms and seceded. I mean, that was a choice that they were given in the law, whether they did that or not.
Right.
And so, you know, I think at the root of it, Bill Bryson, the travel writer, sort of semi-jokingly says, and this is a common, he's not a Marxist, so don't think I'm saying that, but this is a common Marxist complaint about communism not working, not having been tried properly. But he does have a point, you know, if you were to try Marxism, you wouldn't have chosen Russia, is the general line. And he says that the best country really to have tried it would have been England, because people are comfortable with queuing, they will not grumble when they go without, they have an inbuilt sense of fair play, and it would have been a much better experiment. Now, I think it would have collapsed very quickly for all of the reasons that we normally talk about with Orwell and the latent British.
Well, that was Marx's expectation too, wasn't it? That he thought it would either be the United States or Germany.
Yeah. But, you know, the point is that communism, I think, is a terrible idea and always fails whenever it's tried, but it would have been different in different countries. And, for example, you know, when Adolf Hitler came to prominence in Germany, then that Teutonic spirit, as Churchill put it, sort of showed itself. And, you know, when Oswald Mosley marched through the streets of London, people laughed. And had the directives come down, exactly the same directives in London to the local police stations and local army units to do what the Germans did in that period, then there would have been just flat refusals from most of them, because it's in the British culture to say, no, I'm not going to do that, that's an illegal order, sir. You know, so this sort of
I just want to interrupt you for a second. On the subject of Bill Maher, you brought up a couple of times, which, I think this means you watch too much Bill Maher. And I think this is probably not good for you, and we may have to have an intervention here. I mean, I know you do the show from time to time, so maybe you want to see what's going on, but you got to watch this. But I did have to take him to task on something the other day. Speaking of these yokels in the middle of the country, where he was giving Alice Walton a hard time about the $1 billion the Walton family gave to open an art museum in Bentonville, Arkansas, and he made this, you know, snide remark about it being 500 miles away from the nearest people who would want to look at art. So I got thinking about that. I was like, I wonder what Bentonville is like compared to Los Angeles, where Bill Maher is based. So not even accounting for cost of living differences, people in Bentonville make about a quarter more money than people in Los Angeles do, and they're a third more likely to have a college degree. So they're better educated and better off than the average Angelino, and also better than the average New Yorker, which, if you've ever been to Bentonville, this wouldn't surprise you. Bentonville has this weird little sort of mini Beverly Hills, because Walmart basically requires all the people that do X amount of business with them to have someone on the ground there in Bentonville. And Walmart's everyone's biggest account. So, you know, every major corporation that sells retail goods through Walmart has people on the ground there. So Bentonville's actually a very, you know, well-off, highly educated, well-traveled sort of place. And I really dislike that sort of, you know, snide attitude about...
Right, but you see why they dislike those people, because those people are resistant to how they would like to run the country in a way that most other people's citizens simply are not. It doesn't just have to do with healthcare, it has to do with pretty much everything: religion, firearms, speech, schools, civil society.
And we got into this a little bit yesterday, and I'm sorry to interrupt again, but it just made me think of something. You know, we were talking about the firearms issue in the case of Switzerland versus the United States, where the Swiss have just universal, dangerous guns and no murders, and we have, you know, various kinds of arms here and lots of things. But, you know, that sort of chaotic element of our society, the thing that I think is the reason that our local government offices and our national government offices work so poorly, the reason why we have so much crime versus other places that have even more guns than we do, shows itself up in all sorts of ways in our culture. You know, if you look at things like how many Americans per capita die in accidents of all sorts, it's an elevated number. If you look at automobile accidents, it's really very high, even when you control for, you know, miles driven and that sort of thing. So while that sort of, you know, disorderly, refuse to fall in line culture has some really attractive elements, I think, to it, like, freedom and self-government and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there are some downsides, and maybe
Sure.
we don't think about those as much as we should.
Well, there's certainly the consequences of liberty,
Yeah.
and the consequences of liberty, as with anything, are not always positive. And this brings us back to our discussion of free speech and of at-will employment.
Yeah.
You're going to get some negative, indefensible, ugly outcomes.
Right.
The United States allows neo-Nazi groups who say the sorts of things that would strip paint off of a wall anywhere in the world, not just in America, and they are, as I think they should be, at liberty to do that. But that doesn't mean that people don't get hurt or upset in the process. It's true of guns. It's true of boats. It's true of giving people more of their own money. It's true of letting them live. I mean, again, with Bill Bryson's book, he discusses, there's an area, and you'll tell me what it's called, I'm sure, in Pennsylvania, where the coal underground has been on fire for 60 years.
Oh,
70
yeah,
years.
yeah.
And so the ground at the top is very weak now. Now, people live around this area.
Yeah.
And in any other country in the world, he points out, the residents would just have been forcibly moved out by the government because it's incredibly dangerous. But there are still people who are living on top of it because the government can't do that in the United States, and the people don't expect them to be able to do that in the United States, and so they just said, no, I'm staying where I am and I'll take that risk.
Yeah.
Now, is that a good thing? Well, the outcome's not very good, but the property rights that leads to that outcome are defensible.
Yeah, and I think some of the benefits are sometimes underappreciated. Like, are you familiar with a guy named George Lincoln Rockwell?
No.
He's our Roderick Spode. So George Lincoln Rockwell was this guy back in I guess he got started in the 60s and was really active in the 70s. And I believe his outfit was called the American Nazi Party, or the American National Socialist Party. And they wore, Nazi uniforms and things like that, and they would hold rallies and things. And for a while, they were kind of a big thing. They had, a bit of a following and did a lot of public stuff, got a lot of press. But, the ultimate reaction here was the same as it was with your Roderick Spode in Britain, which is that people just sort of laughed at him, and no one really wanted to be affiliated with that. But I think that these sorts of really nefarious tendencies, they're like mushrooms; they grow in the dark, and once you force these things out into the light, it's really hard to build that up. I think that, and this is an unkind comparison. I don't want to say that I think of Occupy as being like the American Nazi Party, although some elements certainly are that and more. But those sorts of tendencies, I think the more you put them out in public, the more you take these kinds of ridiculous positions and these kind of conspiracy-driven narratives and things like that, and let people actually see them.
Right.
Then it goes back to Milton and Areopagitica and all that stuff. That even though I have fairly little faith in people as voters, as citizens, Americans are pretty good, and they can look at this stuff and evaluate it, I think. And when you see the guy marching around in the German army uniform, which you took that lovely video of, I think that tells you a lot about what's going on there.
Sure. I was amazed.
East German.
Yes. It's this beautiful uniform. I was amazed when I was in Texas following Greg Abbott around when he announced his campaign and went on a speaking tour last year to discover in the back areas where there's very little radio, only AM radio, that Alex Jones has a radio show that is broadcast on the airwaves, and that he says all of the crazy, frankly seditious things that he does on his website over the air, and that the American government not only doesn't do anything about it, but allows him to lease the spectrum.
Yeah.
Now, to me, that Alex Jones is saying what he says. I mean, in the court, it's not just sort of moon landing type conspiracy.
I'm glad you brought this up because you're going to get the email on this now and not me.
Sure. But it's not just the moon landing type conspiracies. It's he threatened at one point that if anybody came anywhere near him and his family, he would start shooting them, and that includes cops and the government.
Yeah.
he made all sorts of statements that in Britain would have got him immediately arrested and probably charged and convicted and imprisoned. I forget the details of them, but they were Looney Tunes. I wrote a piece about this. And yet I was absolutely thrilled. I couldn't have been more thrilled to drive and listen to this for 20 minutes, because what it told me was that I'm free. The fact that he could do that meant I'm free. I can say what I like, and nobody's going to come and knock on my door. And that's the beauty of this country, even if it leads to some peculiar outcomes.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm familiar with what Alex Jones's show is roughly, although I've never listened to it. I was just wondering, his conspiracy stuff, is it sort of like the traditional stuff where there are elements of, anti-Semitism to it and all that? Is he that sort of guy, or is he just more of a...
There's a bit of everything.
Yeah.
There's a bit of everything. His primary idea is that every news event is a false flag.
I see.
So 9/11, the Boston bombing. I think it was the Boston bombing that he was talking about, and he said, well, just as the government planned 9/11, they planted this bomb. And yeah, I mean, he's off his trolley, but that's great.
Well, the reason I was asking that is because I have a sort of a long-standing interest in some of this, far right militia, survivalist kind of culture, and I think there's some interesting stuff that goes on over there. It's not really my particular point of view, but there's this one guy, and I'm blanking on his name right now, but he writes these sort of crazy novels about collapse of modern society and Americans fighting it out with the UN troops who are coming in to impose the New World Order.
Helicopter stuff.
And all that. Yeah, all that sort of stuff. But what's interesting is that, and I read, 4 or 5 of his books, is that, this kind of, crazy fringe movement has been undergoing sort of a reformation in a sense, this, sort of a self-imposed change. And so I noticed that in all of his books, there's, a prominent Jewish character who's, treated very well. There's a couple of prominent black characters, and there'll always be some discussion with some guy who used to be, some, anti-Semite, neo-Nazi type who, went to prison or met Jesus or something like that and has reformed his ways and now understands who the real enemy is, which is the United Nations, not your Jewish neighbors. So there's maybe even some hope for that in that part of the world. We were originally going to talk about Hillary Clinton today, and I'm glad that we didn't, but because she's kind of boring and we'll have plenty of time to talk about her. Although, just maybe as a note, we're talking about that sort of chaotic, unpredictable, unruly American culture. So she's now joined the Bush Club of having a shoe thrown at her by someone in public. Not as quick on her feet as W was, I noticed. She was not quite as nimble. So do you think, what does that mean for 2016, Charlie?
She's old. She's an old woman, and I think that her biggest enemy in 2016 is going to be... That noise you hear is the NSA tapping in because we're criticizing Hillary Clinton.
Right.
She is an older woman in a culture that celebrates youth. If she were elected president, she would be the second oldest, I think I'm right, president in American history. Now, older American presidents in the 20th century and 21st century, I presume, will be the same, tend to survive. Ronald Reagan was, I think, 69 when he was elected. George H.W. Bush was pretty old as well. In the 19th century, they just died very quickly, very often in office or just after it. So it's not so much that her age is going to cause a national security problem, although I will note that argument was thrown pretty hard at McCain. But she's going to have a problem standing next to a young person.
Yeah.
I think she could well win. I should put my cards on the table.
Sure,
I think she's extremely strong. But watching her react to the shoe just reminded me, it's a strange reaction, but that she's an older woman.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't say I have a great library in my mind of videos or experiences of people throwing shoes at younger politicians to compare her with. But the way that she acted is how a grandmother acts, not how, say, a 35-year-old woman reacts.
Yeah, maybe we can close out with this, but I don't think it's going to happen, although I really hope that Elizabeth Warren will challenge her in the primary. If only because, now I'm a conservative and I'm sympathetic to the Republicans and may even go back to joining the party one of these days. And as much as I like guys like Mitch McConnell, you know, they're maybe not the most inspiring figures all the time. But if you had a couple of months of debate between Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren on television, Republicans are going to look pretty cool.
Sure.
By comparison. You know,
pretty reasonable, too.
Pretty reasonable by comparison, too. Yeah, and I think that, you know, just as in many ways, the Democrats' best friends have been the Republican opponents they've run against. I mean, I like Bob Dole, but Bob Dole was not going to beat Bill Clinton in any election. And John McCain was not going to beat Barack Obama. I mean, I think I could have beat John McCain that year, probably. So yeah, let's hope maybe they get into it. And in a sense, you know, in terms of what people actually believe politically, I think Elizabeth Warren much better represents where the Democratic Party and the left really is right now.
It absolutely, but not where they need to say they are.
Well, of course not. But you know, if we could have a really honest election, you know, sort of an Elizabeth Warren versus Ted Cruz or Elizabeth Warren versus Rand Paul, that would be, I think, refreshing and entertaining. We promised not to talk about 2016, but here we are again. It is inevitable. We've already run over half an hour, so when we're going to do some kind of abrupt change
today. We're going to have
someone on Twitter was talking about our abrupt endings, and he didn't like them. So